Welcome to the last Voyage Fromage of the year. Really excited. So my name is Julia. A lot of familiar faces and actually a lot of new faces. So welcome to all the new folks who are joining us tonight. Um, um, I am really excited about this month's theme because we are featuring all cheeses from Portugal and accompaniments and crackers from Portugal. I'm just going to do the introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to Mark because Mark actually visited Portugal recently and did a big tour of several cheesemakers, and it was absolutely fantastic to learn from him from his trip. I was hoping to go on that trip with him, but wasn't able to. So Mark is one of our international importers and one of the hardest working people in the cheese industry. Mark was actually up at 3:30 this morning receiving a big shipment of cheese. So it's just a testament to how passionate he is about what he does. And he's really the reason why our Portuguese selection has grown so much over the years. Because it really started out many years ago with just one cheese. And it has since grown and grown and grown. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Mark, who will be taking over from here. So have a wonderful tasting tonight, everybody.
Hey, everybody. My name is Mark. I am the cheese buyer for the Huron Village location of Formaggio Kitchen. And as Julia mentioned, I traveled to Portugal to find some of these cheeses that I feel like pretty strongly about due to the culture and how they're made and why they're made. And I'm here to share that information with you tonight. And so I've traveled many places across Europe to see cheese being made, to accompany people making cheese, to make cheese with people. And Portugal is one of those places that was kind of like a strange, different environment for me to experience these sort of things. And they're all reasons we'll talk about in a little bit. But these cheeses that we have here are a few of the ones that I helped bring into the shop for a specific reason. And so I'm trying to pull up a little bit of how we're going to identify these cheeses. And we'll taste through them. And we'll talk about them and talk about what makes them special and how they're made. And so I think the first cheese that I want to taste with you all is the Cabra Curado. Can everybody identify where the Cabra Curado is? Do you have the names? Yeah. That's the one. So the Cabra Curado has like probably the most rustic rind of all of these cheeses. And the least smooth, the most complex. There's some white, there's some yellow, there's some orange. And so we're going to start with that one. Everybody can find it? Any questions in identifying it? All right. So the Cabra Curado is like a fairly simple cheese. It is made by a cheesemaker that we're going to talk about a couple of times tonight, because this is one of the cheesemakers that I visited while I was over there. And this particular cheese is a little bit out of the ordinary. It's not super traditional. and it's made by a family operation called Bear Lacta, which is a creamery located in the Beira Baixa region of Portugal. The Beira Baixa region is beneath the Serra da Estrela area, where like that's a very known large peak, mountainous peak in Portugal, in eastern Portugal, like almost on the border with Spain. And that is so it's just below that. There's Beira Baixa and there's Beira Alta. And so this is the lower region of the two. And there's a lot of cheese that's being made here. A few of these cheeses that we'll try tonight are being made here. It's a pretty agriculturally focused region. And there's a long history of cheese making in this region as well. And so this one is a goat's milk cheese, raw goat's milk. Aged at least 40 days. We receive it well after that. So it is a little bit more aged than when I first tried it in the region. But there's a lot of complexity to it. And so in this region, there used to be a lot of goat herding. And due to the economy of the region, goat herding was like increasingly more difficult to do. And so this type of cheese almost died out with the goat's milk. This maker decided that they were going to revitalize that, and then they were going to reinvest in a herd of goats, not super easy to find. And they were going to start making this cheese, particularly to represent the locale of where it's being made. So it's raw milk. If you notice the rind, it is pretty funky looking. Lots of colors on it, and they view that as being like a unique representation of the raw milk. So the bacteria and the mold communities that exist in the milk itself. And so that is a pretty striking representation of the milk that they use with the herd that they closely work with, goats, like goat wise. In this region, goat's milk, sheep's milk, it's super expensive. So the cheeses that you're going to see in this region are going to be pretty expensive as well. The cow's milk is a little bit less expensive because it's more readily available. Like in the United States, is less sought, like less expensive. There's less expense involved with producing that sort of milk. Does anybody have any questions about this cheese? Does everybody like this cheese? It's pretty unique.
Mark, can you talk about the quince paste? It seems really dry. It's like,
So the quince paste, yeah.
Yeah.
Quince paste. Quince is a really interesting fruit that's available in
right.
Portugal and Spain. It is a fairly tart fruit, and it's only really used in cooking down. So when you cook it down, you're able to get a little bit of sweetness out of it. The quince paste is probably going to be a little bit more dry and a little less sweet than you would find in Spain. And that I think is like it pairs nicely with the cheese that we have tonight. But characteristically, like Portuguese quince paste is going to be less sweet, a little bit drier than the Spanish counterpart.
Do you have to refrigerate it?
I would refrigerate it after I opened it.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
It's not going to go bad. There's just going to be some mold that's going to grow on it if you're not refrigerating it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks. We love it with this cheese and smeared on the crackers that were sent with the boxes. It just brings it all together in a great bite. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions about this cheese? So the next cheese that we will try is, I'm going to go ahead and do the Castelo Branco, which has a yellowish rind. It's more rounded and fatter than the other one that's going to look like it. And so this is what it looks like that. Very white in the paste. Can everybody find it? It's more creamy. So this is made by the same people. And so like what I was saying is that this creamery is fairly small considering larger productions in the area. But even like being able to visit creameries in the United States and most of Europe, these creameries seem a little bit more industrial, a little less like farmhouse, and there's a reason for that. So all of these cheeses that we're going to try tonight, with the exception of the São Miguel at the end that we'll try, are smaller formats. So they're in wheels that are about like that big around. They're about 2 to 3 pounds. And the reason being is that the cheeses are derived from house-made productions in the area. So this is like I said, it's very eastern Portugal. So there's not a lot around it. If you look at a map of Portugal, the cities that you're going to recognize are on the coast on western Portugal. And so there's a lot of farmland. It's very rural, and the towns are really small. And so like, I don't know, a few hundred people, a couple thousand of people per town are really, really close-knit environments. And so up until about 40 years ago, a lot of these cheeses were being produced by individual households. And so every household would make a little bit of cheese and they would sell it fairly quickly. They didn't have the resources to age these cheeses in a cave. It was intended to sustain a family for a couple weeks as a table cheese, something to carve off of, largely for breakfast. So a lot of farmers going into the fields would bring cheese with them to provide protein and fat and energy throughout their day. But at the same time, it's super nutritionally rich. So with that being said, like a lot of people in their houses would create these cheeses, they would make these cheeses, and they would sell them out of their window. With regulation of food production, obviously, that no longer exists, which is kind of a bummer, but also there's a safety side of things where you're trying to control the safety of these productions, making sure nobody's getting sick, so on and so forth. That, you know, these things are made in larger factory settings. So with that being said, we're used to seeing cheeses from France and from Italy and from Switzerland where there are government subsidies that are creating a standard of production that are low enough for cheesemakers to sustain their lifestyle and selling their cheeses at a premium. Those programs exist because the culture depends on it. Those are countries that have deemed it absolutely necessary for that environment to continue, that industry to continue, for the benefit of the culture of that country. If you look at the statistics of those countries and how much the government subsidizes cost of production, it's crazy. Like it's very, very high. And that's why you're able to find those cheeses, the French, Swiss, so on and so forth, for less expensive than some of these more rare, less sought after cheeses. For example, Portuguese cheese, where the cost of production is still pretty high. It's regulated by the government, but those costs are still fairly high to where it's very hard for you to make a living doing a really, really small production in Portugal. And so you have to find this sort of like middle ground where you can sustain the cost of production, but you're not to the level of being so disconnected from the milk, from the cheese, from the process, so on and so forth. And so this company, like I said, is still family run. Father still runs it, but his two daughters are very involved in the business, and they are very instrumental in driving the business forward. And so Castelo Branco is probably my favorite cheese they found while I was over there. This one particular creamery, they make, I think it's 3 name protected cheeses. Castelo Branco, there's a cheese called Amarello, and then I can't remember the last one, but they are all raw milk, all thistle coagulated. And I'll talk about that in a second. And they've been made for decades by the people of that region. Oh, it's picante, which is probably the coolest cheese that I saw being made while I was over there. You're going to be intrigued, but honestly, if I put it on a plate in front of you, you would not be very excited by it, because it is very interesting, to say the least. And so Castelo Branco traditionally was made in the town of Castelo Branco. All sheep's milk, like I said, thistle coagulated, meaning this is a total vegetarian cheese. There is no animal rennet added to the process, and so cardoon thistle is pulverized and added to the milk for the coagulation effect that you would normally get from the enzyme from a calf's stomach, which is rennet. It is effective. It is a little bit different flavor wise. It is a little bit different from a make perspective, but it's something that was available to the people in this region as they were learning to develop cheese. And it's something that traditionally has been seen in Portuguese cheese for a long, long time. And so I love this cheese, particularly if you can save some for breakfast with like a cup of tea, something sweet. The membrillo would be really nice. The quince paste would be really nice with this. Pumpkin jam would be really, really good with this. But I would have like little slabs of this with a little bit of chorizo in the morning and a cup of coffee, and it's really, really nice. Just because it is so rich, it is so salty. It is a natural rind, and so what you see on the exterior, the pristine sort of yellow, almost wax-like exterior, is a product of the environment. And I think it's really delicious. The texture blows me away every time. It is a little. It is very fruity, actually, with a pretty unique, almost cured ham, like cured meat, like quality saltiness to it. So it's fruity. There's umami to it. And the texture is very, very rich and creamy. Yeah, I love that cheese. What does everybody think about that cheese? Is it something that you would expect? Is it unexpected? Any thoughts? Any reactions to it?
I love both those cheeses.
Mhm.
They both have a really kind of grassy,
Yep.
musty kind of. Is that from what the sheep and the goats are eating, or is that because it's raw milk?
Both. Yeah. So that's a great question. So the effect of raw milk is from contamination of the milk. It's from bacteria that's added to the environment where the cheese is getting made. In this environment, a lot of the flavors that you're going to pick up on are as a result of the contamination of bacteria that gets introduced to the udder of the animal during the milking. And so when you think about what an animal is doing in their day to day, that's going to be on their udder, they're laying down in grass, they're grazing on grass. All of these things is they're introducing different bacterias and different microorganisms to the milking scenario, the milking equation that's going to influence the way that the cheese tastes. And so a lot of what you're tasting is, yeah, because it is raw milk, because those bacterial communities are at a level that's going to dominate the development of that cheese. And so those bacteria will then in turn break down the proteins and the fats in the milk that are going to create the flavors that we taste in cheese. And so, yeah, you're right in both regards. Has to do with what the animal's eating, but also the physical environment of where the animal is. Any other questions?
I was gonna say that at first I didn't like it, but the more I ate, it kind of grew on me.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it was interesting. It was different.
It's totally different.
Yeah.
This is not like a flavor profile that you're gonna get from your like more typical French or even British or Italian cheeses. This is something that to me is so uniquely Portuguese that I wanted to offer it. And this is something that I would take home on my own and eat it, like I said, for breakfast. On a cheese board, it could be super interesting, especially with nuts, something like a preserved fruit. But it wouldn't be my first choice. But I think it's an extremely well-made cheese that deserves like a nod of offering something interesting and something different. Any other questions? Cool. So we'll move on and talk a little bit about Nisa, which is the other cheese that looks fairly similar. So it's got a pretty pale rind. Again, naturally rinded, fairly pale paste, a little bit drier than the Castella Branco, and a little bit more creamy than the goat cheese. The only one that's left has a black rind on it, and so that'll give you an indication for what we're tasting now. And so let's taste that real quick, and we can talk about it. But this is a different maker. Nisa is a town in a fairly similar region of Portugal. And I should say Portugal has, I believe, when I was there, it was 13. I think it's somewhere between 13 or like it's somewhere that's 13 or 14 name protected cheeses. All the name protected cheeses are raw milk. And that's a number that was higher than I expected because I didn't know that many name protected cheeses. And so the Castelo Branco is name protected, and the Nisa on this board are name protected. And then there are other cheeses that are not set to that sort of standard, that sort of legal standard. And so the Baixa, or I'm sorry, the Castelo Branco and the Nisa are made in similar regions. They're both sheep's milk, they're both raw sheep's milk, but you'll definitely be able to taste the difference.
This one's really good. I find maybe it's just that it's less salty to me.
Less salty.
But it's my favorite so far.
What else would you say about the flavor of the cheese? Any thoughts?
When I smelled it before we even tasted, I just felt like it was a little bit more honeyed on the
Yeah.
rind when I was smelling it.
Yeah.
And I could get the salami and the Castello, so they've all been really interesting. But as soon as I tasted the Nisa, I thought this is something I would buy again to have to put on a cheese plate or whatnot.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That didn't occur to me until you said it, but there's definitely a honey quality to it. It's not washed in honey. There's nothing honey added to this cheese, but it has that honey-like sweetness to it. I would say it's far nuttier than the Castelo Branco. But I think that this is, more of a mellow cheese. All of these cheeses, these first three cheeses, when they're made without adding salt to the production. And so early on in the stages, they're caked with rock salt, like coarsely ground, either sea salt or like a naturally derived salt. Does anybody know why you would use like a naturally derived salt versus doing something more commercial grade? No. So salt is encased with tons of minerals, and those minerals are used by the microbiology that makes cheese what it is. So we're talking molds, we're talking yeasts, and we're talking bacteria. And so all of those things require minerals in their development. And so those things are going to be instrumental in the ripening of a cheese. Not to mention the osmosis of adding salt to curd is what makes cheese cheese. Cheese, by definition, has salt added. And why that salt gets added, most of the time it's through a brining process where you soak the cheese in a very concentrated brine that encourages the swap of water in the curd and salt. And so that's how you introduce salt to a lot of cheeses. There are also cheeses where you add salt during the make process. So like as you are separating the curd and the whey and you're molding that curd, you're adding salt to that. And that's going to obviously make the flavor way better, but also create cheese by definition. And so this is a cheese that's made, and like in the early stages of its life, it is caked with the salt and then it's left to age. And so introducing salt on the exterior of the cheese is both salting the curd And so you're creating that flavor that you need from salt, but it's also creating an environment on the exterior of the rind that is only habitable by certain types of bacteria and molds. So you're controlling the environment of the cheese. We all know that fermentation exists in cheese. Cheese is a fermented product, and fermentation, by definition, is the controlled spoilage of a product. And so, what you're doing by salting the rind is you're creating an environment where bacteria is allowed to eat up all of the lactose that's available in milk and convert it to lactic acid. And that's what makes cheese. So, that's what makes it fermented, and that's what makes it what it is, delicious and palatable. And if you are treating the exterior with a certain substance, you're doing so to try to help that process occur without any contamination in a bad way. And so contamination in a bad way could look like E. coli, could look like listeria, and those things are fairly rare in cheese, but they can occur if the process is not done correctly to control that spoilage. If you allow those microorganisms to take a strong hold in the product and develop and reproduce in a way that's going to make someone sick by eating it. Any other thoughts of this? Oh, like I'll talk about where it's made. So it's made by Herdad, if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, Herdad de Maya, which is in a town that's I would say it's probably about like an hour and a half away from the place that made the Cabo Corrado and the Castelo Branco. And it is like pretty different of a production. The facilities are fairly similar. Like everything's pretty pretty cut and dry. Everything's pretty, it feels industrialized, but like there are 50 employees working there. It's not like a mass production. It's just everything is super sterile. Everything's metal. Everything is under a lock and key. Like everything is fairly guarded off rather than being some rustic cave. And so both productions are fairly small. I would say when we went to the first production, the first two cheeses, the person that led us around was the daughter of the owner, and she was a total sweetheart. She dealt with most of the production on a personal level, and her sister, who was out on maternity leave, dealt with more of the business aspect. With Herdad de Maya, the person that was running the operation, she's like a general. Like it is crazy. Both women run, I would say, yeah, both women run operations. But it was really cool and kind of intimidating to see her run her operation, where she walked in her room and people stiffed up. And she would say, "What's going on with that? What's going on with that?" And to us, she was super personable, but she ran a tight ship. And so she is looking for consistency. She is looking for a highly valued product, highly valued output, where she held the standard very, very high. And so this is one of the cheeses that's why you taste such finesse with it. Both productions extremely exceptional in their standards for quality. But it is really interesting to see how the economic policies affect how the cheese is being made and the environment in which it's being made. versus the United States, where we still get very, very farmhouse productions. Does everybody like this cheese, like the Nisa? I know one person mentioned that this is their favorite so far.
I think I like the first two better. I like the
Yeah.
aromatics and that how it gets up in your nose when you're eating it. I enjoy that. I have a question for you.
Sure.
I haven't heard you mention any of the other rinds and the cheeses we've done in the past being put in salt. Is that a common or is that rare?
Super common. I would say it's difficult because depending on the production of the cheese, a lot of times it's soaked in a brine. And so most of your Alpine cheeses are both soaked in a brine and then washed with salt after that, or just washed with salt afterwards. With something like your cheddars, like those are salted in the milling process. And so that's a whole different ball game, but you're salting the curd as you're making the cheese. And so when you make that cheese, you don't have to worry about salt being introduced. I have had some cheeses where they forgot to salt the curd, and is like so disgusting. But most of the time, I would say like like to answer your question is very, very good, but it totally depends on the production of the cheese and what type of cheese you're making, because it's going to influence everything. These cheeses, the three that we just tried, are heavily salted after the form has been made. And they're salted for, I think, a couple of weeks, 4 or 5 times. And that's where you get the salt introduced. The cheese that I mentioned before, Picante, which is another name protected cheese that is made by both of these places, is something that's so unique. Like it's something I've never seen a production like it, where you're using the same milk and sheep's milk, and you are creating a similar format. So we're talking like a very small format, something like that. And what you're doing with that is you're making the cheese, you're letting it drain, so you're letting the whey drain from it. You're caking it in salt, and then you're aging it on hay, which is a variable that's extremely hard to control for. So you have salt introduced, you have hay that is regulating moisture, but there's also some bacterial contamination. And then you are washing it on a daily basis with water. And so these things are sopping wet with water, and you're aging them in rooms that are unrefrigerated, which is wild, for about 2 years. And so when we're thinking about cheese, like we're thinking about like a 2-year-old cheese is something that is a large wheel that can stand that sort of aging, that sort of process. When you're talking about a small wheel, something that's 2 or 3 pounds being aged for 2 years, that's crazy. And even though it's soaked in water in an environment where there's no refrigeration, like I'm talking, these rooms had windows up in the corner that were open, and I went in April, it was like 80 degrees. That is the exchange that you're talking about. So these cheeses are sweating out all their fat. And it's something that is sought after by a lot of the more traditional cheese connoisseurs of the area. And they shave it like very, very thinly cut, and they enjoy it like that. I thought there's no way I can bring this back to the United States. First of all, like that could cause a huge issue. The FDA alone would be like, what is going on here? Like there are no plans for cleanliness. Not saying that they're very sterile environments. They're very like regulated environments, but to our standards of how we operate, it would never fly. But flavor wise, if it is something that I could bring in and be like, oh, this is cool. Flavor wise, I don't think anybody would really bite because it is such a particular flavor. I would liken it to like Pecorino Romano if it was drier and spicier. And that's just something that I couldn't do. But seeing that being made was like one of the most awesome, to the truest sense of the word, experiences of my tenure at Formaggio Kitchen. Because everything is so rigid. Everything's like fairly similar. Like, yeah, you get variations from this place or this place being having more traditional cheese made in certain ways, but that one cheese, I was like, this is crazy, this is wild. And it's like, what more could they add to make it more wild? And so that was a really cool environment to see happen, as a contrast to like some of these more regulated environments where cheese is being made. A lot of these, like these first three cheeses, are made in the same environment, but they're so removed. There's refrigeration, there is high regulation. So Picante is like this one special thing that they're all doing. And it's really, really cool to see. Any other questions so far? We'll move on to San Miguel. Cool. So San Miguel is the final cheese. It's a cow's milk cheese. This one is pasteurized. And it is going to remind you of a different style of cheese that you probably wouldn't expect to see in Portugal. And we can talk about that a little bit. But I love this cheese because it is so different. Let's taste it first. So immediately I noticed that the texture crumbles when I start biting into it, but it's not dry. There's a salty, savory quality to it. And then this really interesting, like, herbaceous bitterness to it that's not off-putting. It's salty, but not too salty. But it reminds me of a different style of cheese that I typically wouldn't expect to see in Portugal. What does everybody think about this cheese?
It's really salty,
No.
Really, really salty.
like
Yeah.
kind of burns a little bit with
It
the
burns.
salt. Yeah.
It has that tendency to make your gums tingle,
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
which you can see. Yeah, the astringency. You'll see a lot in Italian cheeses, Italian sheep's milk cheeses, but this is cow's milk from Portugal. And a lot of times that is technically an allergic reaction. Similar to similar to like when you eat spicy food, the heat that you feel is a reaction. A bodily reaction, and this is somewhat similar. Some people really like this sensation and some people not so much, but I do see it a lot in Italian cheeses as well. So if you look at the exterior of the cheese too, it's coated in a black wax, and so that is what sort of sparked my interest. I'm like, wait a second. Like, what other countries do we see wax introduced onto the exterior. Yeah, we get some wax coated cheddars here, but what's the most popular wax coated cheese?
Gouda.
Gouda.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pronounced Howda.
Yeah, exactly. And so what wax does to a cheese, it sort of removes the variable of the rind. And so a lot of times you're letting the environment interact with the exterior of the cheese to develop a unique flora of the environment that's going to affect the taste, but the ripening of the cheese, texture of the cheese, the appearance, the aroma, so on and so forth. When you coat a cheese in wax, you're essentially sealing everything in, but you're also shielding all the exterior environmental influences. And so why that's important is most of these Goudas from the Netherlands or from Belgium are aimed towards aging out. And so when you age something for a long time, what you're super concerned with is the loss of moisture. You don't want to create a cheese that's going to be so dry that it's like not palatable. But at the same time, you're trying to seal in the flavors, the aromas that exist in the milk, and you're guarding it from the environment, guarding it from humidity, exterior flora, so on and so forth. And so this is that type of cheese. So this cheese is aged around 9 months. The Michael and Ellen, the one that you got, it might be an older wheel. So it's gonna be saltier, more concentrated, and have a little bit more of that like stinging like quality to it. But what I thought was super cool and interesting about this cheese is like there's not a lot of information about it online. It's known as the black rinded cheese, obviously from the wax. But then you start to look at migration patterns of where it's being made and what influences are being introduced to the region where it's made. And so this cheese is from the Azores. And the Azores did not have a largely significant Dutch colonization. Like it was always Portuguese, but the Portuguese had a hard time bringing farmers from Portugal to the Azores during the establishment of those islands as part of their colony. And so what ended up happening, a lot like areas of the United States where we started calling in help from other parts of the world, was the Portuguese said, all right, we need help with populating these islands and creating agriculture on these islands. And so they called in wealthy business owners from the Netherlands. And so it wasn't vast, but this is a product of some of that influence coming to the Azores from the Netherlands and establishing agricultural roots and saying, hey, here's how we make cheese. Let's make something similar here. So by and large, what I've noticed about the Portuguese versus the French or the Italians or Spanish, Belgians, the UK, all over Europe is I saw cheese a lot more often in the country for breakfast than I did for dinner as an appetizer, which I very rarely see in Europe, and more so often I see as a dessert or as a meal in itself. But I saw a lot of cheese for breakfast. And that makes sense because the way that these cheeses were established, They were established to sustain the working class. And so for a breakfast, you need something super nutritionally charged to fuel you throughout the day, to give you the energy, the protein, and the fats needed to work out in the field all day, or work in a manual fashion throughout the day. And so a lot of these cheeses, especially the first three, I saw being paired with fresh fruit, with jams, with bread, with cured meat, tea, coffee for the breakfast. And I think that that's where they're the best shown. But I think that they're all interesting cheeses, and cheeses worth mention. A lot of times we focus on the French, we focus on the Italian, which are all fantastic cheeses. But we fail to realize that there's a whole world of cheese out there. And they're going to have different flavors that we're used to, but that doesn't make them lesser in quality, and it doesn't make them lesser in value. It just makes them different and culturally significant in different ways. And so I think we should take that philosophy and apply it when we're talking about British cheese, we're talking about American cheese, we're talking about South American cheese. All of these areas, there's plenty of room for discovery. And I think that that's something worth talking about. Because we all know the French cheese and they're all fantastic. They're classics for a reason. But there's a whole world of cheese to explore out there.
Question, Mark. So talking about all of these cheeses and so on, what's your process of finding all of these different cheese makers and so on in these small places, maybe different language than and so on?
Yeah, so that's a great question. This, in Portugal specifically, I had the pleasure of traveling around with a gentleman that we buy all these cheeses from. He's an exporter of Portuguese goods. His name is Manuel Maia. He's the funniest, coolest, most hospitable dude that I have traveled with. And he made it a point to take me to places where he thought that I could get value from. And so when I travel abroad to try cheese, I say, is this good? Is this something that's delicious? Is this something that I enjoy? If it's something that's delicious that maybe I don't enjoy, I think, okay, is this something my customers will enjoy? Is there a demand for this? There are certain cheeses that I bring in that are not my cup of tea, but I know that they're quality, and I know that my customers are going to appreciate them. Furthermore, out of that, I think, okay, what do I have that fills this void on my selection? And does this fill a niche? Is this going to add something to my selection that I don't have available in the first place? And so if the answer is yes, and it fits all the other categories of the way I think about things, I say, okay, like I need to bring this in. I look at the price, obviously, and I say, okay, will someone pay $45 a pound for this cheese? Because that's the bottom line. We're not making a killing off this. It is a very strict structure where the farmer is going to get what they need to sustain themselves, or probably even a little bit less. And then all of those factors combined, then I make the determination of like, yeah, this is something that I need to bring in, or no, this is something I can do without, even if I might enjoy it. It's something that I could, that's not gonna be a demand for my customers.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
Mark, you mentioned a lot of these cheeses as being good at breakfast, and I don't, do people in Portugal eat them for breakfast? And if so, what else do they eat with them for breakfast?
With the breakfast, it's like your typical like European breakfast. So like you'll get a lot of yogurt, jams, like preserved fruit, fresh fruit, cured meat. Yeah, coffee and tea.
Thanks.
Yep. Bread. Yeah, Max, do you have a question?
They all went really well with that.
You kept it.
No, I bought more.
Oh, you got more.
Yeah, it's my second batch. Anyway, really nice. I like the first cheese the best.
Yeah.
And the third. They were all good though, but very
Yeah.
different. I was scared at first because they all looked the same, and I'm like, ah! But I had
Yeah.
them labeled, and I knew what we were doing.
They look
Thanks,
very
Mark.
similar. Yeah. So Max enjoyed it with Cuban pineapple soda.
Yeah.
And so my family is Cuban, and she attended one of my Cuban cooking classes. But yeah, it makes total sense because that soda is so sweet.
Yep.
And so the sweet with the salty, the more earthy, the fruitiness goes really nicely. Yeah.
And also, between the quince paste, I had honey on my plate, and I had apricots. I also have walnuts, but I'm saying that was all the same. I said, hey, this has to go well, and it did.
You're absolutely right. I think you're right.
Thanks, Mark.
Yep. Any other questions?
I was curious, the first three cheeses all came from about the same size wheel.
Yeah.
How much bigger was the wheel for the last cheese?
Much bigger. And so we're talking a 2 or 3 pound wheel for the first three. And the last one is about 15 to 20 pounds.
Oh, wow. That big a difference. Okay.
Yeah, that big of a difference. Yeah. But again, like if you're trying to age something out further, like the first three cheeses are aged for 40 days at least. We get them a little bit later because we have our own rules in the United States. So we have to get them past 60 days. But with the larger cheese, with the San Miguel, it's aged 6 months, 9 months, a year, 2 years. And so it's aimed towards aging out longer. If you have something bigger in mass, it's going to survive for a longer period of time in aging situations.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? I think we're nearing the end of our conversation. Right? Well, I hope everybody learned a little bit something about Portuguese cheese. Maybe learned an appreciation for exploring some other areas of the cheese world that are so close to what we know, what we already know, and what's established of European cheese. And let's start branching out and discussing some of these other areas and talking about the cultures and what they're doing for cheese and their history. Because there's some really good stuff out there that we need to talk about and we need to try and we need to explore. And so I hope everybody got a little sense for that. I think Portuguese is a little bit more accessible. When we're talking about European cultures, we're all familiar with Portuguese, Spanish, so on and so forth. So it seems a little bit more familiar to us. But some of these traditions and these cultures have been around for hundreds of years, and they sort of they fall into the shadow of the French and the Italian and the Swiss, who have those mega influences in the cheese world. So let's start talking about some of these smaller countries that have some interesting things to say about the preservation and the fermentation of milk.